You're nothing but a broken soldier who can't even hold down a job." That's what my sister Emma said to me at the family barbecue right before she slipped something into my drink, thinking I wouldn't notice. But 20 years in the Army teaches you to watch everything, especially when your own sister is married to Judge Richard Blackwood, the man who could destroy your life with a single court ruling. What she didn't know was that I'd already switched our glasses, and in 30 minutes, her perfect husband would be the one failing the sobriety test she'd arranged for me. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I'm Jessica Martinez, and I've been invisible in this family since the day I came back from my 3rd deployment. Not invisible because I was quiet, but invisible because they couldn't figure out how to fit a female combat veteran into their perfect suburban narrative. Emma had always been the golden daughter, the one who married well, lived in the right neighborhood, and never had to worry about anything messier than which wine to serve at dinner parties. I was the one who served overseas, who came back with scars they couldn't see and stories they didn't want to hear. The barbecue was supposed to be a celebration of Emma's 10th wedding anniversary, held in the sprawling backyard of their colonial mansion in Westchester County. The guest list read like a who's who of local politics and high society. Judge Blackwood's colleagues, Emma's country club friends, our parents who still introduced me as our daughter who was in the military, as if that explained everything they needed to know about my current unemployment status. I'd been job hunting for 8 months since my medical discharge. The VA benefits helped, but they weren't enough to cover rent in any decent neighborhood. Emma knew this. She also knew that I'd been staying in a studio apartment above a garage, working odd jobs, trying to piece together something that looked like a normal life. What she didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything, every slight, every dismissive comment, every time they treated me like a charity case at family gatherings. The afternoon started normally enough. I arrived in my best dress pants and a button-down shirt, clean but clearly from a discount store. Emma greeted me with that practiced smile she'd perfected over the years, the one that said, family obligation, rather than genuine warmth. Judge Blackwood shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who wanted to appear supportive of veterans, while secretly believing we were all damaged goods looking for handouts. "Jessica, so good to see you," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for people he considered beneath his social station. "How's the job search going?" "Still looking," I replied, keeping my voice steady. I'd learned not to elaborate. Any mention of the challenges facing female veterans in the civilian job market was met with polite nods and quick subject changes. The first few hours passed with familiar patterns. I helped in the kitchen when Emma needed extra hands, listened to conversations about vacation homes and private schools, and watched my niece and nephew play in the pool while their parents networked with people who could advance their careers. I was the helper, the background support, the one who could be counted on to carry trays and clean up spills without being asked. But I noticed things too. Military training doesn't just switch off because you're at a family barbecue. I noticed how Judge Blackwood's eyes lingered on the young wives of his colleagues. I noticed the way Emma's smile faltered when she thought no one was looking. I noticed the prescription bottles lined up in the bathroom medicine cabinet when I went to wash my hands, bottles with names that didn't match anyone in the household. The real trouble started around 4 o'clock when the conversation turned to local politics. Someone mentioned a case involving a veteran who'd been arrested for drunk driving, and Judge Blackwood launched into a speech about accountability and how military service didn't excuse criminal behavior. The irony wasn't lost on me, considering what I'd discovered about his own prescription drug habits during my previous visits to their house. "Some people think their service entitles them to special treatment," he said, looking directly at me. "But the law is the law, regardless of what uniform you used to wear." Emma nodded along, adding, "It's like Jessica always says, you can't live in the past forever. Sometimes you have to face reality and make better choices." I'd never said anything of the sort, but correcting her would have caused a scene. And causing scenes was Emma's territory, not mine. Instead, I excused myself to get a drink from the bar set up on the patio. That's when I saw Emma follow me, her movements too casual, too deliberate. She started making drinks for both of us, chattering about the success of the party, how wonderful it was to have everyone together. I watched her hands as she mixed the cocktails, watched her fumble with something small and white that disappeared into one of the glasses. She was nervous, talking too fast, not making eye contact. "Here you go, Jess," she said, handing me the glass with the slightly cloudier liquid. "Your favorite vodka tonic." I'd never told her vodka tonic was my favorite. In fact, I rarely drank alcohol at all, something she would have known if she'd ever bothered to pay attention to me at these gatherings. But I took the glass, thanked her, and waited for her to turn away before making the switch. The beauty of military training is that you learn to think 3 steps ahead while maintaining perfect composure. While Emma was congratulating herself on whatever she thought she'd accomplished, I was calculating timing, watching the crowd, and planning my next moves. Judge Blackwood was holding court near the pool, gesturing expansively with his own cocktail, completely unaware that his wife had just tried to drug his sister-in-law. I didn't know exactly what Emma had slipped into the drink, but I had suspicions based on the prescription bottles I'd seen. Something that would make me appear intoxicated. Something that would justify a call to the police. Something that would give Judge Blackwood the opportunity to play the disappointed family member forced to have his veteran sister-in-law arrested for public intoxication or worse. The plan was probably simple: discredit me, remove me from family gatherings, maybe even get me committed for evaluation. After all, who would believe the unemployed veteran over the respected judge and his perfect wife? It was elegant in its cruelty, the kind of calculated move that required both opportunity and complete disregard for the target's humanity. But Emma had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated the person she was trying to destroy. 20 years of military service teaches you more than just how to follow orders. It teaches you how to assess threats, how to adapt under pressure, and how to turn your opponent's strategy against them. She thought she was dealing with her broken little sister who needed rescuing from her own poor choices. She was actually dealing with a combat veteran who'd spent 2 decades learning how to survive situations far more dangerous than a suburban barbecue hosted by people who thought their biggest problems involved wine selections and college applications. The glass switch was just the beginning. What happened next would teach my family exactly who they'd been underestimating all these years. As I watched Judge Blackwood raise Emma's doctored drink to his lips, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my discharge: complete control over a situation that someone else had tried to orchestrate against me. For the first time in months, I wasn't the victim of circumstances beyond my control. I was the one writing the script, and my sister and her husband were about to discover that the broken soldier they'd dismissed was far more strategic than they'd ever imagined. The moment Judge Blackwood took his first sip from the switched glass, I knew there was no going back. I stood there with Emma's original drink in my hand, the clear liquid catching the afternoon sunlight, while my sister beamed with satisfaction at what she believed was her successful sabotage. She had no idea that her carefully orchestrated plan was about to implode in the most spectacular way possible. I am the kind of person who notices details. In Kandahar, noticing details kept you alive. Here in Westchester County, noticing details was about to save my life and destroy theirs. The way Emma kept glancing at her watch, checking the time every few minutes. The way she positioned herself near the garden gate where she'd have a clear view of the driveway. The way Judge Blackwood's colleague, Detective Morrison, just happened to be at this anniversary party despite being on duty, his radio conveniently clipped to his belt, even in civilian clothes. This wasn't just a family barbecue. This was an ambush. I'd grown up in this family dynamic, always 3 steps behind Emma's machinations, always cleaning up the messes she created while she emerged spotless and sympathetic. When we were kids, she'd break Mom's vases and let me take the blame. In high school, she'd steal money from Dad's wallet and act shocked when they found it in my backpack. The pattern was always the same. Emma creates chaos, Jessica bears consequences. Family rallies around Emma's wounded innocence. But I wasn't a confused teenager anymore. I was a 38-year-old woman who'd commanded troops in active combat zones, who'd made life-and-death decisions under enemy fire, who'd earned the respect of soldiers who initially doubted whether a woman belonged on the front lines. The skills that made me an effective leader overseas were the same skills that let me see through Emma's suburban warfare tactics. Judge Blackwood was still holding court by the pool, his voice getting louder as he shared war stories about difficult defendants and lenient sentencing guidelines. He gestured broadly with the glass, completely absorbed in his own performance. Emma watched him with the intensity of someone waiting for a show to begin, her fingers drumming against her thigh in nervous anticipation. I decided to get closer, to observe the situation from a better vantage point. Military reconnaissance isn't just about watching from a distance. Sometimes you need to embed yourself in the environment to gather intelligence. I walked over to the group surrounding Judge Blackwood, positioning myself where I could monitor both his condition and Emma's reactions. The problem with these veterans' courts, Judge Blackwood was saying, his words already starting to slur slightly, is that everyone expects special treatment. Military service doesn't excuse criminal behavior. I don't care if you served in Iraq, Afghanistan, or the moon. You break the law. You face consequences. The irony was staggering. Here was a man who regularly took unprescribed medication, who'd been having an affair with his court clerk for the past 6 months, who'd used his position to get his nephew out of a DUI charge just last year, lecturing about accountability and legal consequences. I knew all of this because I'd been paying attention during family dinners, because I'd learned to listen when people thought I was just the quiet, damaged veteran in the corner. Detective Morrison nodded along with Judge Blackwood's speech, occasionally, checking his watch in the same pattern as Emma. The coordination was obvious once you knew to look for it. They were waiting for something specific, some predetermined signal or timeline that would justify Morrison's intervention. I watched Judge Blackwood take another long sip from the glass, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed Emma's cocktail mixture. Whatever she'd put in there was fast-acting. His pupils were starting to dilate, and he was swaying slightly even while standing still. The confident gestures were becoming more exaggerated, less controlled. Emma noticed, too. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick message, probably alerting Morrison that the show was about to begin. I could see her excitement building, the way her breathing quickened and her cheeks flushed. She thought she was about to witness my destruction, the final removal of the inconvenient sister who reminded everyone that their perfect family narrative had some uncomfortable chapters. What Emma didn't understand was that I'd been documenting everything for months. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every family gathering where I was treated like hired help rather than blood relative. Not because I was planning revenge, but because I'd learned in the military that detailed records could save your life when someone tried to throw you under the bus. Judge Blackwood's condition was deteriorating rapidly. He'd moved from slightly slurred speech to outright confusion, stumbling over words he'd used fluently just minutes before. The other guests were starting to notice, exchanging concerned glances and moving slightly away from him. Emma watched, with poorly concealed anticipation, like someone waiting for fireworks to begin. I knew I had maybe 10 more minutes before whatever Emma had dosed the drink with reached its full effect. 10 minutes to position myself strategically, to ensure that when the explosion happened, I wasn't standing in the blast radius. I excused myself from the group and walked toward the house, ostensibly to use the bathroom, but actually to retrieve something I'd hidden earlier. During my previous visits to Emma's house, I'd noticed that Judge Blackwood was careless with his personal information. He left his laptop open, his phone unlocked, his home office door ajar during family gatherings. Old habits from my intelligence-gathering days made me curious about what kind of man my sister had married, what kind of secrets might be hiding behind his public facade of judicial integrity. What I'd found was more damaging than I'd expected. Financial irregularities that suggested possible bribery. Email communications with his court clerk that went far beyond professional relationship. Photos and documents that painted a picture of corruption, adultery, and abuse of power. I'd copied everything onto a flash drive during the last family dinner, insurance against a situation exactly like this one. Emma's plan was simple. Drug me, have me arrested, destroy my credibility forever. My counterplan was more elegant. Let her drug her own husband, document his public intoxication, and use the resulting chaos to expose the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. Judge Blackwood was now openly stumbling, holding on to furniture for support while trying to maintain his composure. The other guests were definitely concerned now, some approaching to ask if he was feeling all right. Emma's excitement was palpable. She kept checking her phone, probably wondering why Morrison hadn't made his move yet. The beautiful thing about Emma's plan was that it required precise timing. She needed me to appear intoxicated at exactly the right moment, when Morrison could intervene without seeming suspicious. But I wasn't the one who was intoxicated. Judge Blackwood was, and his condition was becoming impossible to ignore. I returned to the patio just as Judge Blackwood dropped his glass, the crystal shattering against the stone and sending cocktail mixture splashing across several guests' shoes. He mumbled an apology, his words so slurred they were barely comprehensible. Emma's face went white as she realized something had gone terribly wrong with her carefully orchestrated plan. Morrison finally approached, but not to arrest me as planned. He was responding to the obvious emergency of a sitting judge who appeared to be having some kind of medical episode at a public gathering. Emma watched in horror as her husband became the center of unwanted attention, the very attention she'd intended to direct at me. I stood there holding my clear, uncontaminated drink, completely sober and increasingly fascinated by the disaster unfolding around me. For the first time in months, I wasn't the problem that needed fixing. I wasn't the embarrassment that needed managing. I was simply an observer watching my sister's perfect world begin to crumble under the weight of her own malicious intentions. The chaos escalated faster than Emma could control it. Judge Blackwood was now openly swaying, his expensive polo shirt soaked with sweat despite the mild September weather. He tried to lean against the patio railing for support, but misjudged the distance, stumbling forward and nearly colliding with Mrs. Henderson, the mayor's wife, who jumped back with a startled gasp. "Richard, are you feeling all right?" asked Dr. Carmichael, one of the few genuine friends at the party rather than a political connection. He approached with the careful concern of someone who'd seen medical emergencies before. Judge Blackwood tried to wave him off, but his hand coordination was clearly compromised. "I'm fine, just fine," Judge Blackwood slurred, his words running together like thick syrup. "Just need some air, that's all." He attempted to straighten his posture but overcorrected, swaying backward until Detective Morrison stepped forward to steady him. Emma's panic was becoming visible to anyone who knew how to read body language. She kept smoothing her dress, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood whenever her plans went sideways. Her eyes darted between her husband and Detective Morrison, silently pleading for him to somehow salvage the situation. But Morrison was trapped by his own professional obligations and the crowd of witnesses surrounding them. I watched the scene unfold while maintaining my position near the bar area, sipping my clear, untainted drink and marveling at how quickly Emma's perfect anniversary party was dissolving into public spectacle. The other guests were forming a loose circle around Judge Blackwood, their conversations shifting from polite social chatter to concerned whispers about his obvious distress. "Should we call an ambulance?" suggested someone from the back of the crowd. Emma immediately jumped in to squash that idea. No, that's not necessary," she said, her voice pitched higher than usual. He's just been working too hard lately. The stress of the courthouse renovation project, you know how these big cases can be. But Judge Blackwood wasn't cooperating with her damage control efforts. He was now mumbling incoherently about constitutional law and fishing trips, topics that had no connection to the current conversation or situation. His pupils were dilated to the point where his blue eyes looked almost black, and he kept blinking slowly as if trying to focus on something just out of reach. Detective Morrison was caught in an impossible position. He couldn't ignore the obvious signs of intoxication in a sitting judge, especially not in front of a crowd of witnesses that included several prominent community members. But he also couldn't arrest his friend's husband without some explanation for how the situation had developed. I could see him calculating options, trying to find a way to handle this discreetly. Maybe we should get Judge Blackwood inside where he can rest more comfortably, Morrison suggested, clearly hoping to move the situation away from public view. But Judge Blackwood had other ideas. "I don't need to rest," he declared loudly, his voice carrying across the entire patio. "I need another drink. Emma, where's my drink? You made me such a good one earlier." He started looking around for the glass he'd dropped, patting his pockets as if he might have stored it there. The crowd's discomfort was now impossible to ignore. These were people who valued appearances above almost everything else, and they were witnessing one of their own, making a complete spectacle of himself. Some guests were already making excuses to leave, gathering their purses and checking their phones for urgent messages that suddenly required their immediate attention. Emma tried one more time to control the narrative. "Richard, honey, why don't you come inside and splash some water on your face? You'll feel better after you cool down a bit." "Water?" Judge Blackwood looked confused by the suggestion. "Why would I want water when Emma makes such excellent cocktails? She's very talented with cocktails, you know, very creative with her ingredients." The comment sent a chill through me, but Emma looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Judge Blackwood was unknowingly revealing details about her involvement in the situation, details that could expose the entire scheme if anyone bothered to investigate further. Dr. Carmichael stepped closer to Judge Blackwood, his medical training overriding social politeness. "Richard, I'm going to check your pulse if that's all right. You seem to be experiencing some kind of reaction." "Reaction to what?" Judge Blackwood asked, his voice getting louder and more belligerent. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a judge. I uphold the law. I don't break the law like some people." His unfocused gaze wandered around the crowd until it landed on me. "There she is," he said, pointing in my direction with an unsteady finger. "The veteran who thinks she deserves special treatment. Emma was just telling me about her problems, always causing problems, that one." The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke. Even in his compromised state, Judge Blackwood was trying to shift blame in my direction, following the same script Emma had probably coached him on earlier. But the timing was all wrong, the context was all wrong, and I was clearly the most sober person at the entire gathering. Several guests turned to look at me, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern. I remained calm, taking another sip of my drink and meeting their gazes steadily. My military bearing and obvious sobriety stood in stark contrast to Judge Blackwood's deteriorating condition. "I think there might be some confusion here," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent patio. "I've been standing right here the entire time, and I haven't had more than half of this one drink." I held up my glass, the liquid level clearly visible to everyone around me. Morrison was now openly studying both Judge Blackwood and me, his detective instincts clearly engaged despite his personal relationship with the family. He could see the obvious contradiction between Judge Blackwood's accusations and the evidence in front of him. Dr. Carmichael had managed to get close enough to take Judge Blackwood's pulse, his expression growing more concerned by the moment. "Richard, your heart rate is elevated, and your coordination is clearly impaired. Have you taken any medication today? Any prescription drugs or supplements?" Medication? Judge Blackwood's voice took on a defensive tone. I don't take medication. Medication is for weak people. Ask Emma, she handles all that stuff. Another revealing comment that made Emma's face go even whiter. She was desperately trying to signal him to stop talking, but his ability to read social cues was completely compromised by whatever substance was now coursing through his system. The party atmosphere had completely evaporated. The remaining guests were now openly staring at the unfolding drama, some pulling out their phones to record what was obviously going to become a significant local scandal. A sitting judge publicly intoxicated at his own anniversary party was exactly the kind of story that would dominate social media and local news cycles for weeks. Morrison made his decision. I think we need to have a serious conversation about what's happening here, he announced to the group. Judge Blackwood, I'm going to need you to come with me so we can figure out what's going on. Emma finally found her voice. That's not necessary. Detective Morrison, this is just a family matter. Richard is clearly not feeling well, but there's no need to involve law enforcement. But Morrison was already moving into official mode, his demeanor shifting from friendly guest to investigating officer. Ma'am, when a sitting judge appears to be under the influence of an unknown substance at a public gathering, it automatically becomes a law enforcement matter. I have an obligation to investigate. Judge Blackwood tried to object, but his words were becoming increasingly incoherent. He kept insisting that he was fine while simultaneously demonstrating that he was anything but fine. The contradiction was becoming more obvious with each passing minute. I remained in my position by the bar, watching Emma's careful plans disintegrate in real time. She'd wanted to frame me for public intoxication, but instead she'd drugged her own husband in front of dozens of witnesses, creating exactly the kind of scandal that could destroy both their reputations and his judicial career. The beauty of the situation was that I didn't have to do anything except stand there and let Emma's own scheme play out to its logical conclusion. She'd provided all the rope necessary to hang herself. I just had to avoid getting tangled up in it. The moment Detective Morrison reached for his handcuffs, something inside me snapped into absolute clarity. This wasn't just about surviving Emma's sabotage anymore. This was about 20 years of being treated like a broken toy that the family kept in storage, brought out occasionally for patriotic holidays, and then quickly put away when my presence became inconvenient. Watching Judge Blackwood stumble and slur while Emma's face turned, ashen with panic, I realized I was done being their scapegoat. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the murmur of shocked guests. Detective Morrison, before you proceed, I think you should know that I witnessed something earlier that might be relevant to Judge Blackwood's condition. Emma's head whipped toward me so fast I thought she might get whiplash. Her eyes were wide, with terror, silently begging me to stay quiet, to protect the family reputation the way I always had before, but those days were over. What did you witness, Miss Martinez? Morrison asked, his pen already out and notepad appearing in his hand with practiced efficiency. I saw my sister Emma preparing drinks about 45 minutes ago. She was acting nervous, fumbling with something small and white that she put into one of the glasses. When she handed me my drink, she specifically mentioned it was my favorite, even though she's never asked me what my favorite drink is in the 10 years I've been coming to these gatherings. The crowd's attention shifted between Emma and me like spectators at a tennis match. Emma opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out. Judge Blackwood was leaning heavily against a patio chair now, his head lolling to one side as he tried to follow the conversation. That's ridiculous, Emma finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessica is obviously trying to deflect attention from her own problems. Everyone knows she's been struggling since she left the military. The unemployment, the financial stress, the adjustment issues. But Morrison wasn't buying it. His trained eye was taking in the scene, me standing steady and articulate, holding a barely touched drink, while Judge Blackwood could barely form coherent sentences. The evidence was literally staggering around in front of him. Miss Martinez, Are you saying you believe your sister attempted to drug you? Morrison asked directly. This was my moment of choice. I could back down, minimize the situation, protect Emma the way I'd always protected her before. Or I could tell the truth and watch her perfect world implode. The old Jessica would have taken the hit to preserve family harmony. But the old Jessica had never been set up for arrest by her own sister. I'm saying that Emma put something in a drink intended for me, and Judge Blackwood ended up consuming it instead. Whether that constitutes attempted drugging is a legal determination that I'm not qualified to make. The precision of my language wasn't lost on Morrison or the remaining guests. I wasn't making emotional accusations or wild claims. I was presenting facts in the measured tone of someone who'd given testimony in military tribunals and knew the weight of words spoken under oath. Judge Blackwood suddenly lurched forward, grabbing Morrison's arm with surprising force. "She's lying," he slurred, pointing vaguely in my direction. "Emma told me all about her problems. The drinking, the pills, the psychiatric evaluations. She's not stable, can't hold a job, can't function in normal society." Each word hit me like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because they revealed the depth of the conspiracy against me. Emma hadn't just planned to drug me tonight. She'd been laying groundwork for months, spreading lies about my mental health and stability, building a narrative that would explain away my arrest and subsequent incarceration. Dr. Carmichael, who'd been quietly observing Judge Blackwood's deteriorating condition, stepped forward with professional authority. "Detective Morrison, in my medical opinion, Judge Blackwood is exhibiting signs of acute intoxication or drug impairment. His pupils are severely dilated, his speech is slurred, and his coordination is significantly compromised. This is not consistent with alcohol consumption alone." The medical assessment carried weight that my accusations couldn't. Dr. Carmichael had no stake in family drama, no reason to lie or exaggerate. His clinical observation was devastating to Emma's position. Morrison made a decision that changed everything. "I'm going to need to collect that glass for testing," he announced, pulling out an evidence bag. "Judge Blackwood, you're going to need to come with me for a blood test and formal evaluation." "You can't arrest a judge," Judge Blackwood protested, his words so garbled they were almost unintelligible. "I have immunity. Judicial immunity protects me from this kind of harassment." But Morrison was already reciting Miranda rights, his voice carrying across the silent patio where 30 of Westchester County's most prominent citizens watched a sitting judge get arrested at his own anniversary party. The social implications were staggering. These people would be talking about this night for years. Emma made one last desperate attempt to control the situation. "This is all a misunderstanding," she announced to the crowd. "Richard hasn't been feeling well all week. He's been taking medication for a back injury. This is just an unfortunate interaction with alcohol." But her explanation raised more questions than it answered. If Judge Blackwood was taking prescription medication, why hadn't she mentioned it when he first started showing symptoms? Why had she been so insistent that he didn't need medical attention? And why was she only mentioning this crucial information now, after her husband had been placed under arrest? Morrison wasn't finished with his investigation. "Miss Martinez, I'm going to need a formal statement from you about what you observed earlier. And I'll need to test your drink as well, for comparison purposes." I handed over my glass willingly, confident that it contained nothing more suspicious than vodka and tonic water. Emma watched the exchange with the expression of someone witnessing her own execution. As Morrison led Judge Blackwood toward his unmarked police car, the judge's condition continued to deteriorate. He was now completely dependent on Morrison's support to remain upright, his legs barely functioning well enough to shuffle forward. Whatever Emma had put in that drink was powerful and fast-acting. The remaining party guests began dispersing rapidly, eager to distance themselves from the scandal but equally eager to spread the news. By tomorrow morning, Everyone in their social circle would know that Judge Richard Blackwood had been arrested for public intoxication at his own anniversary party, and that his sister-in-law had accused his wife of drugging her. Emma stood alone, on her patio, surrounded by abandoned cocktail glasses and the debris of her ruined celebration. Her perfect anniversary party had become a crime scene, her respected husband was in police custody, and her carefully maintained reputation was dissolving faster than sugar in water. I watched her survey the destruction of everything she'd worked to build, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered the psychiatric evaluations she'd invented, the employment problems she'd fabricated, the months of character assassination she'd conducted behind my back to prepare for this moment. Why? I asked her, the question hanging between us like a challenge. Emma looked at me with tears streaming down her face, mascara creating dark tracks on her cheeks. Because you don't belong here, she whispered. You never belonged here. Mom and Dad have been supporting you for months, making excuses for you, worrying about you constantly. I thought if you were gone, if you were committed somewhere safe, everyone could finally move on. The casual cruelty of her reasoning was breathtaking. She'd tried to destroy my life not out of hatred, but out of convenience. I was an inconvenience, to be removed, a problem to be solved, a stain to be cleaned from the family image. You are going to have me arrested, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. You are going to have me committed to a psychiatric facility based on lies you've been telling for months. Emma didn't deny it. She couldn't. The evidence was too overwhelming, the situation too clear. Instead, she did what she'd always done. When caught in her schemes, she tried to make herself the victim. I was trying to help you, she sobbed. You need help, Jessica. You've been struggling, and I thought maybe forced treatment would give you the structure you need to get better. But I was done listening to her justify attempted destruction as attempted rescue. I was done being the family problem that needed solving. Most importantly, I was done being the quiet one who absorbed damage to keep everyone else comfortable. The history between Emma and me stretched back to childhood, but the pattern had crystallized during my military years when I was safely overseas, and couldn't defend myself against her carefully constructed narratives. While I was serving my second deployment in Afghanistan, Emma had been busy rewriting my story for the family, transforming me from their daughter, the soldier, into their daughter, the problem case. It started with small distortions during my first deployment, phone calls home where Emma would express concern about my letters, claiming they sounded disconnected or troubled. She'd share her worries with our parents, who were already anxious about having a daughter in a combat zone, and her interpretation of my communications became their reality. When I described the intensity of military life, Emma translated it as signs of trauma. When I mentioned missing home, she presented it as evidence of mental instability. By the time I returned from my first tour, the family dynamic had shifted. Instead of celebrating my service, everyone seemed to be watching me for signs of breakdown. Emma had positioned herself as the concerned sister who was monitoring my adjustment, the family expert on veteran issues despite having never worn a uniform herself. She'd researched PTSD symptoms online and applied them liberally to every interaction I had with the family. During my brief leave between deployments, I noticed how conversations would stop when I entered rooms, how family members would exchange meaningful glances when I shared stories from overseas. Emma had created an atmosphere of worried surveillance around me, training everyone to see pathology in normal behavior. When I laughed at something funny, it was manic behavior. When I was quiet, it was concerning withdrawal. When I expressed frustration with civilian life, it was evidence of my inability to readjust. The second deployment gave Emma more ammunition. She started forwarding articles about veteran suicide rates to our parents, sharing statistics about divorce and unemployment among returning service members. She joined online support groups for military families, not to support me, but to collect horror stories that she could apply to my situation. By the time I came home again, she'd essentially convinced everyone that my mental collapse was inevitable. My third deployment was when Emma's campaign became truly destructive. She began telling people that I'd confided in her about dark thoughts and violent tendencies. She shared fabricated conversations where I'd supposedly admitted to struggling with anger management and substance abuse. The family started treating me like a bomb that might explode at any moment, their interactions careful and strained. When I was medically discharged after an IED explosion injured my back and left me with chronic pain, Emma's predictions seemed to come true. I was struggling with physical therapy, dealing with VA bureaucracy, and facing the challenge of translating military skills into civilian employment. But what looked like normal adjustment difficulties to anyone familiar with veteran transitions, Emma presented as confirmation of everything she'd been saying for years. She convinced our parents to stage an intervention before I'd even been home for 6 months. They gathered in the living room of my childhood home, armed with pamphlets about veteran mental health services and a list of treatment facilities that Emma had researched. She'd prepared talking points about their concerns, complete with examples of my concerning behavior that she'd either exaggerated or completely invented. I sat through their prepared speeches about getting help, about how much they loved me, about how they just wanted me to be safe and healthy. Emma cried as she recounted fictional conversations where I'd supposedly expressed suicidal thoughts. Our mother clutched tissues while Emma described episodes of aggressive behavior that had never happened. Our father looked uncomfortable, but nodded along with Emma's assessment that I needed professional intervention. The intervention failed because I refused to admit to problems I didn't have, refused to accept treatment for conditions I didn't suffer from. But Emma spun my resistance as further evidence of my deteriorating mental state. She told everyone that denial was a classic symptom of PTSD, that my refusal to accept help proved how serious my problems had become. The job search difficulties that every veteran faces became, in Emma's narrative, evidence of my unemployability due to mental instability. The normal challenges of translating military experience into civilian terms became proof that I couldn't function in normal society. The fact that I preferred my own company after years of constant group living became social withdrawal, requiring immediate intervention. Emma's masterpiece was the medication narrative. She started telling people that I was supposed to be on psychiatric medications, but kept refusing to take them consistently. She described fictional conversations with my non-existent therapist, sharing fake concerns about my compliance with treatment protocols. She even went so far as to research specific medications, learning enough about antidepressants and mood stabilizers to sound credible when discussing my supposed prescription regimen. The financial support our parents provided wasn't presented as temporary assistance for a veteran transitioning to civilian life. Emma framed it as enabling behavior, a desperate attempt to keep their mentally ill daughter housed and fed while she refused proper treatment. Every dollar they gave me became evidence of my dependence. Every month I stayed in my studio apartment became proof of my inability to achieve independence. What made Emma's campaign so effective was her apparent concern and love for me. She never spoke about me with anger or resentment, always with worry and sadness. She positioned herself as the only family member brave enough to acknowledge how serious my problems were, the only one willing to push for the difficult interventions I supposedly needed. She cultivated relationships with other military families, joining support groups and online forums where she could share her concerns about my deteriorating condition. She became an expert on veteran issues, able to quote statistics and reference research studies about post-combat adjustment disorders. When she spoke about me, it was with the authority of someone who'd done her homework, someone who truly understood the scope of veteran mental health challenges. The most insidious part of Emma's strategy was how she used my own words against me. She'd take normal expressions of frustration or disappointment and recontextualize them as cries for help. When I mentioned feeling isolated, she presented it as dangerous depression. When I expressed anger about bureaucratic delays in my disability processing, she described it as explosive rage that frightened her. By the time Judge Blackwood entered the picture, Emma had spent years building a comprehensive case for my mental instability. She'd created a detailed history of concerning behaviors, failed treatments, and family interventions. She'd positioned herself as the long-suffering sister who'd tried everything to help me, but was running out of options. Meeting Judge Blackwood gave Emma's efforts a new dimension. Suddenly, she had access to someone with the legal authority to force the interventions she'd been advocating for years. She could finally move beyond family pressure and support group commiseration to actual legal action that would remove me from the equation permanently. The psychiatric evaluation she'd planned wasn't meant to get me help. It was meant to get me committed, declared incompetent, removed from family gatherings and family decisions. She'd spent years building a case for my mental illness, and Judge Blackwood could provide the court order that would make her fiction into legal fact. What Emma never understood was that I'd been documenting her campaign against me almost from the beginning. The realization hit me like incoming artillery fire during a quiet moment at last year's Christmas dinner. I was sitting in the corner of Emma's living room, watching her orchestrate the evening with surgical precision, when I suddenly understood that I wasn't paranoid. Emma really was systematically destroying my reputation, and she'd been doing it so skillfully that even I had started to doubt my own perceptions. That Christmas night, while everyone else was distracted by dessert and holiday movies, I'd excused myself to use the bathroom and found myself standing in Emma's home office. Her computer was open, logged into her Facebook account, and I could see a private message thread with our cousin Rebecca. The conversation was about me, and it was devastating. Emma had written paragraph after paragraph describing my supposed mental deterioration. She detailed fictional episodes of erratic behavior, invented stories about concerning phone calls, and shared fabricated worries about my stability. She described me as someone barely hanging on to reality, dangerous to myself and potentially dangerous to others. Rebecca's responses were sympathetic and alarmed, offering to help however she could. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the systematic nature of Emma's communications. She had similar message threads with our aunt, with family friends, with neighbors. She'd created an entire network of people who believed I was mentally ill and potentially violent. She'd been conducting a character assassination campaign with the thoroughness of a military operation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Standing in that office, scrolling through months of lies about my mental state, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, but crack. The way ice cracks before it shatters completely. Emma hadn't just been spreading rumors about me. She'd been building a legal case, creating a documented history of my supposed instability that could be used to have me committed against my will. I took photos of everything with my phone, screenshots of the message threads, pictures of printed emails she'd saved in a file folder labeled Jessica Health Concerns. She'd been keeping records of her own fictional narrative, probably to show to doctors or lawyers when the time came to have me forcibly committed. That night marked the beginning of my own documentation campaign. If Emma was building a case against me, I needed to build a case for myself. I started recording our phone conversations, keeping detailed journals of family interactions, and most importantly, researching Emma's own vulnerabilities. The truth about Judge Blackwood's character wasn't hard to uncover once I started looking. During family dinners at their house, I'd noticed how he interacted with the young women who worked for the court system. His comments were always just slightly inappropriate, his attention lingering a few seconds too long, his compliments crossing professional boundaries in ways that made me uncomfortable. I started paying closer attention during family gatherings. Judge Blackwood would drink too much and become loose with information about cases, sharing details that should have remained confidential. He'd brag about sentences he'd imposed, joke about defendants who'd appeared before him, and reveal personal information about court personnel that had no business being discussed at dinner parties. The prescription drug issue became obvious when I started using their guest bathroom regularly instead of the powder room near the kitchen. Their medicine cabinet was like a pharmacy, filled with bottles of medications prescribed to different people at different times. Some were clearly legitimate prescriptions for Judge Blackwood's back problems, but others belonged to people I'd never heard of, with dates going back years. I researched the medications online and discovered that several were controlled substances commonly abused for their sedative or euphoric effects. Judge Blackwood was either collecting prescriptions from multiple doctors or acquiring medications through other means. Either way, it was illegal and potentially dangerous, especially combined with his obvious alcohol consumption. The affair with his court clerk became apparent during a family barbecue earlier in the summer. I'd gone inside to help Emma with something, and overheard Judge Blackwood on a phone call in his study. He was speaking in the low, intimate tone people use with romantic partners, making plans for a weekend getaway with someone who definitely wasn't my sister. I started listening more carefully during subsequent visits, and the pattern became undeniable. Late-night phone calls, secretive text messages, unexplained absences from family events. Judge Blackwood was having an affair, and he was careless about hiding it from anyone who bothered to pay attention. The financial irregularities took longer to discover, but they were the most damaging. During a dinner party where Judge Blackwood had drunk too much wine, he'd bragged about some recent investment opportunities that had come his way through his position on the bench. He mentioned meeting with contractors who were bidding on courthouse renovation projects, discussed real estate deals that seemed to benefit from his insider knowledge of municipal planning decisions. I started researching public records, tracking property transactions and business licenses connected to Judge Blackwood's name. What I found was a pattern of financial activity that seemed to correlate suspiciously with cases that had appeared before his court. Companies owned by his friends and relatives were receiving lucrative municipal contracts. Properties he'd invested in were being rezoned for commercial development shortly after his rulings on related cases. The documentation process became my new mission. Every family gathering was an intelligence gathering operation. I brought small, recording devices, took photos when possible, and wrote detailed reports immediately afterward. I created digital files with timestamps and metadata, ensuring that my evidence would be admissible if I ever needed to use it. Emma never suspected that I was building a countercase against her and her husband. She was too focused on her own campaign to destroy me, too confident in her narrative about my mental instability to imagine that I might be fighting back with the same systematic approach she was using against me. The irony was perfect. While Emma was creating fictional documentation of my mental illness, I was creating factual documentation of her husband's actual crimes. While she was building a case to have me committed, I was building a case that could have Judge Blackwood disbarred, divorced, and potentially imprisoned. I realized that Emma's plan to drug me at the anniversary party wasn't just about removing me from family gatherings. It was about creating a final, dramatic incident that would justify having me committed permanently. She needed something more substantial than her months of fictional narratives. She needed an actual arrest, an actual psychiatric hold, actual, legal documentation of my supposed mental breakdown. The beauty of her plan was that it would have worked perfectly if she'd succeeded. A veteran arrested for public intoxication at a family gathering, with a documented history of mental health concerns and family interventions, would have been exactly the kind of case that could result in forced psychiatric evaluation and potential long-term commitment. But Emma had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that I was the same broken person who'd come home from military service, the same damaged veteran who'd struggled with civilian adjustment. She didn't realize that I'd been rebuilding myself quietly, methodically, with the same discipline and strategic thinking that had made me an effective soldier. She thought she was dealing with someone who'd been weakened by combat and overwhelmed by civilian life. She was actually dealing with someone who'd been hardened by betrayal and motivated by the desire for justice. The switch from victim to strategist had happened so gradually that even I hadn't fully recognized it until the moment I swapped our glasses at the anniversary party. Standing there watching Judge Blackwood stumble and slur while Emma's perfect plan collapsed around her, I realized that I'd stopped trying to earn my place in their dysfunctional family dynamic. Instead, I'd been preparing to expose the dysfunction itself, to reveal the corruption and cruelty hiding behind their facade of respectability. The discovery that changed everything happened 3 weeks before the anniversary party, during what Emma thought was a routine family dinner. Judge Blackwood had excused himself to take a phone call in his study, leaving his laptop open on the kitchen counter where he'd been showing Emma vacation photos from their recent weekend in the Hamptons. I was helping clear dishes when I noticed the screen displayed his email inbox, and one particular subject line made my blood freeze. Martinez psychiatric evaluation, court order request. My hands went cold as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just Emma's campaign of character assassination anymore. This was an active legal proceeding that Judge Blackwood was orchestrating from his position on the bench. He was using his judicial authority to circumvent normal legal protections, preparing to have me forcibly committed based on Emma's fabricated evidence of my mental instability. I glanced toward the study where Judge Blackwood's voice was still audible, then quickly scanned the email thread. The messages revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond what I'd imagined. Judge Blackwood had been corresponding with Dr. Patricia Wynn, a psychiatrist who specialized in involuntary commitments, discussing the parameters of my case as if my incompetence was already established fact. The emails referenced documentation provided by family members and concerning behavioral patterns consistent with PTSD-related psychosis. They discussed the legal requirements for emergency psychiatric holds and the process for obtaining court-ordered long-term treatment. Dr. Wynn had already reviewed Emma's fabricated evidence and agreed that I posed a danger to myself and others, requiring immediate intervention. But the most chilling part was the timeline. Judge Blackwood and Dr. Wynn had scheduled my psychiatric evaluation for the Monday following the anniversary party. They were planning to have me arrested at the party, held over the weekend on psychiatric grounds, and evaluated by a doctor who'd already decided I was mentally incompetent based on Emma's lies. I used my phone to photograph every email in the thread, my hands shaking as I captured evidence of the conspiracy to destroy my life. Judge Blackwood was literally buying my freedom from a psychiatrist who was willing to rubber stamp an involuntary commitment in exchange for future referrals from his court. The financial arrangements were spelled out in coded language, but the meaning was clear. Dr. Wynn's private practice received significant referrals from Judge Blackwood's court for psychiatric evaluations in criminal cases. In exchange for her cooperation in my case, Judge Blackwood would continue to send her lucrative court-ordered evaluations that she could bill to the state at premium rates. I discovered that this wasn't their first collaboration. The email thread referenced previous cases where they'd worked together to have inconvenient family members committed. Judge Blackwood's ex-wife's sister had been institutionalized using the same process after she'd threatened to expose his affairs. A business partner's son had been committed when he'd started asking questions about financial irregularities in their real estate deals. Emma and Judge Blackwood had refined this process into a reliable system for eliminating problems. They would build a case through systematic character assassination, create fake documentation of mental illness, then use Judge Blackwood's judicial authority to force psychiatric evaluation by a doctor who was already paid to reach predetermined conclusions. The truly terrifying part was how legal it all appeared on the surface. Judge Blackwood would recuse himself from my case due to family connections, but he'd already arranged for his colleague Judge Davidson to rubber stamp the commitment order. Dr. Wynn would provide the psychiatric evaluation, declaring me incompetent and dangerous based on Emma's fabricated evidence. Everything would be properly documented, legally executed, and completely fraudulent. I photographed financial documents that showed payments from Judge Blackwood's personal accounts to Dr. Wynn's practice disguised as consulting fees. I captured email exchanges where they discussed other cases, other victims who'd been eliminated through forced psychiatric commitment. The scope of their corruption was staggering. But the most damaging evidence was a recorded phone conversation between Judge Blackwood and Dr. Wynn that I found saved in his computer's audio files. They discussed my case in detail, with Dr. Wynn, agreeing to find me incompetent regardless of my actual mental state during the evaluation. She outlined the specific diagnosis she would use, the legal justifications she would provide, and the long-term treatment facility where I would be placed. Judge Blackwood's voice was clear and calculating as he explained that my commitment needed to be permanent. He couldn't risk having me released after a few months when I might expose their scheme. Dr. Wynn assured him that she could arrange for a diagnosis severe enough to justify indefinite commitment, probably in a state facility where I would have no meaningful contact with the outside world. The recording revealed that they'd used this same process to eliminate at least 6 other people over the past 3 years. Business rivals, inconvenient family members, potential witnesses to their various schemes. Each victim had been systematically discredited, then forcibly committed based on fabricated psychiatric evidence. I realized that Emma's years-long campaign against me wasn't just sibling rivalry or concern for my mental health. It was preparation for a permanent solution to what she saw as the problem of my existence. Once I was committed, she could control the narrative completely. I would become the tragic sister who'd succumbed to combat trauma, requiring institutional care for my own safety and the safety of others. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. My military service, which should have been a source of pride and respect, would become the explanation for my supposed mental breakdown. My struggles with civilian adjustment, normal for any veteran, would be presented as evidence of dangerous instability. My independence and refusal to accept their version of reality would be characterized as paranoid delusions requiring medical intervention. Judge Blackwood had even prepared for the possibility that I might try to fight the commitment. The legal system was designed to favor psychiatric professionals and judicial authority over patient testimony. Once Dr. Wynn declared me mentally incompetent, my own words would be dismissed as symptoms of my illness. Any attempt to expose their conspiracy would be characterized as paranoid fantasies typical of my diagnosed condition. The recording included discussion of the facility where they planned to place me. It was a private psychiatric hospital that specialized in long-term care for patients with violent tendencies and delusional disorders. The cost was substantial, but Judge Blackwood had arranged for my VA benefits and family resources to cover the expenses. Emma would become my legal guardian, controlling my finances and medical decisions indefinitely. They'd even planned my funeral, in a sense. Emma had prepared statements about my tragic decline, my family's heartbreak over my condition, and their difficult decision to seek professional help when I became too dangerous to remain in the community. She would become the grieving sister who'd tried everything to save me, the long-suffering family member who'd finally been forced to make the hardest choice of her life. But their careful planning had one fatal flaw. They'd assumed I was the same traumatized veteran who'd returned from deployment, struggling with adjustment and dependent on family support. They hadn't accounted for the possibility that I might have been rebuilding myself quietly, documenting their activities, and preparing my own strategic response to their campaign against me. The anniversary party wasn't just Emma's opportunity to frame me for public intoxication. It was my opportunity to turn their own weapons against them, using their corruption and conspiracy to destroy the lives they'd built on fraud and manipulation. The strategy I developed wasn't about revenge, it was about survival and justice. Having discovered the full scope of Emma and Judge Blackwood's conspiracy, I realized that simply defending myself wouldn't be enough. They had too much power, too many resources, and too much invested in my destruction to simply abandon their plan. I needed to dismantle their entire operation before they could regroup and try again. My military training had taught me that the best defense is often a calculated offense, and that successful operations require multiple contingencies. I couldn't just rely on the glass switch at the anniversary party to save me. I needed to create a comprehensive counter-strategy that would expose their corruption while protecting myself from retaliation. The first element of my plan involved the evidence I'd been collecting. I created multiple copies of every document, recording and photograph, storing them in different locations, including a safety deposit box, cloud storage accounts, and with a trusted army buddy who lived across the country. If something happened to me, if I was suddenly committed or arrested, the evidence would automatically be released to specific media contacts and law enforcement agencies. I researched Dr. Wynn's background and discovered that she'd been under investigation by the state medical board 2 years earlier for inappropriate relationships with patients. The investigation had been quietly dropped after Judge Blackwood had dismissed criminal charges against her in an unrelated case. The connection wasn't coincidental. It was evidence of an ongoing corrupt relationship that went far beyond my situation. The financial trail led to even more damaging discoveries. Judge Blackwood's bank records, which I accessed through public financial disclosure requirements for judges, showed regular payments to shell companies owned by Dr. Wynn's family members. The amounts coincided perfectly with the timeline of controversial psychiatric commitments that had appeared before his court. But I needed more than just evidence of their corruption. I needed to create a situation where they would expose themselves publicly, where their conspiracy would be revealed in a way that couldn't be covered up or explained away. The anniversary party provided the perfect opportunity because it would take place in front of witnesses who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. I spent weeks preparing for that evening, studying Emma's habits and Judge Blackwood's behavior patterns. I knew that Emma would be nervous about executing her plan, which would make her sloppy and obvious. I knew that Judge Blackwood would be overconfident, assuming that his judicial authority protected him from serious consequences. The timing had to be perfect. I needed Emma to drug the drink early enough in the evening that there would be plenty of witnesses to Judge Blackwood's deteriorating condition, but late enough that the effects would peak during the period when Detective Morrison was supposed to arrest me. The switch would only work if Judge Blackwood consumed enough of the drugged cocktail to become obviously impaired. I arranged for additional documentation by inviting my cousin Rebecca to the party, the same cousin who'd been receiving Emma's fictional updates about my mental health. Rebecca was a nurse with experience in emergency medicine, someone who would be able to provide professional medical testimony about Judge Blackwood's condition and Emma's suspicious behavior. The most crucial element of my strategy was the letter I'd prepared for delivery the morning after the anniversary party. The letter was addressed to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, the State Attorney General's office, and the medical board that licensed Dr. Wynn. It contained complete documentation of the conspiracy, including the emails, recordings, and financial evidence I'd collected over the previous months. But the letter wouldn't be sent automatically. I needed the anniversary party to provide the final piece of evidence, the smoking gun that would make the conspiracy undeniable. Judge Blackwood's public intoxication, combined with Emma's obvious involvement in drugging the drinks, would provide the criminal behavior necessary to trigger a full investigation. I'd also prepared a backup plan in case the glass switch somehow failed. I'd contacted an investigative journalist who specialized in judicial corruption, providing her with enough preliminary evidence to begin her own research. If I was arrested or committed before I could execute my primary strategy, she would publish the story within 48 hours. The psychological preparation was almost as important as the tactical planning. I had to be ready to watch Emma's world collapse while maintaining my own composure and credibility. Any sign of satisfaction or vindictiveness would undermine my position as the victim of their conspiracy. I needed to appear shocked and saddened by the revelations, not triumphant about their downfall. I practiced my responses to various scenarios, rehearsing the exact words I would use when Detective Morrison asked about Emma's behavior. I memorized the timeline of events I'd witnessed, ensuring that my testimony would be consistent and detailed enough to support criminal charges. The hardest part was accepting that this would destroy my family permanently. Even if our parents eventually learned the truth about Emma's campaign against me, the revelation would shatter their faith in both their daughters. They would have to accept that one daughter had spent years lying about the other, and that their son-in-law was a corrupt judge who'd abused his position to eliminate inconvenient people. But the alternative was worse. If I allowed Emma and Judge Blackwood to proceed with their plan, I would spend the rest of my life in psychiatric custody, forgotten and silenced while they continued to destroy other victims. My sacrifice would enable their corruption to continue indefinitely. I also had to prepare for the possibility that my strategy might not succeed completely. Even if I exposed their conspiracy, powerful people like Judge Blackwood had resources and connections that could limit the consequences they faced. I needed to be ready for a prolonged legal battle, one where they would use every available resource to discredit me and minimize their own culpability. The evening of the anniversary party, I felt the familiar calm that had always preceded dangerous missions overseas. All the planning was complete, all the preparations were in place, and now I had to execute the operation with precision and discipline. There was no room for emotional reactions or second-guessing. I had one opportunity to turn their trap into their downfall. As I dressed for the party, I thought about all the veterans who'd faced similar betrayals from the people they'd trusted most. Family members who'd stolen their benefits, spouses who'd abandoned them during their darkest moments, institutions that had failed to protect them when they needed help most. My fight wasn't just about my own survival. It was about proving that veterans couldn't be discarded and silenced when we became inconvenient. The glass switch at the anniversary party was just the opening move in a larger strategy designed to expose corruption, protect future victims, and restore my own dignity and freedom. Emma and Judge Blackwood had spent months preparing to destroy me, but they'd underestimated their target. They thought they were dealing with a broken veteran who could be easily manipulated and disposed of. They were about to discover that they'd actually been dealing with a combat-trained strategist who'd been preparing her own mission while they planned mine. The fallout from Judge Blackwood's arrest began before Detective Morrison's police car had even left the driveway. I watched from Emma's living room window as neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the flashing lights and the spectacle of law enforcement at the Blackwood residence. Cell phones appeared in hands, recording videos that would be circulating on social media within hours. Emma stood frozen on her patio, surrounded by abandoned cocktail glasses and the wreckage of her carefully planned evening. The remaining guests were leaving in clusters, their conversations hushed but urgent as they processed what they'd witnessed. These weren't just random partygoers. They were judges, lawyers, city council members, and prominent business owners. The scandal would spread through Westchester County's power structure like wildfire. Dr. Carmichael approached Emma with professional concern, but she waved him away, insisting that she was fine despite her obvious distress. Her hands were shaking as she gathered abandoned plates and glasses, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy to the scene of her husband's public humiliation. "Emma," I said quietly, moving closer to where she was frantically cleaning. "You need to stop and think about what happens next." She looked at me with eyes that were equal parts hatred and desperation. "This is all your fault," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "You did something to him. You sabotaged his drink somehow." Accusation was exactly what I'd expected, but it revealed how completely Emma had lost control of the situation. She was so focused on blaming me that she couldn't see the obvious question. How could I have sabotaged a drink that she had prepared and handed to me herself? "I didn't sabotage anything," I replied calmly. "I switched our glasses after you drugged mine." "Judge Blackwood consumed whatever you put in that cocktail, Emma. Whatever was supposed to happen to me happened to him instead." The color drained from her face as the full implications hit her. She'd essentially poisoned her own husband while trying to frame me. and she'd done it in front of dozens of witnesses who could testify about her suspicious behavior during the drink preparation. My phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Morrison. "Need you at the station tomorrow morning for formal statement. Bring any evidence you have about tonight's events." The investigation was already underway, and Emma's window for damage control was rapidly closing. "You have to help me," Emma said suddenly, grabbing my arm with desperate intensity. "You have to tell them it was an accident, that you misunderstood what you saw. Richard could lose everything. His career, his reputation, our whole life." The irony was staggering. Emma was asking me to lie to protect the same man who'd been planning to have me forcibly committed based on her fabricated evidence. She wanted me to sacrifice my credibility to save the reputation of someone who'd conspired to destroy my freedom permanently. "No," I said simply. "I'm going to tell Detective Morrison exactly what I witnessed. You put something in a drink intended for. Me and Judge Blackwood consumed it instead. That's what happened, and that's what I'm going to testify to." Emma's desperation shifted into rage. "You vindictive bitch," she hissed. "You planned this somehow. You wanted Richard to get arrested. You wanted to destroy our family." But her accusations only made her look more guilty. She was essentially admitting that she'd put something harmful in the drink, while simultaneously claiming that I'd somehow orchestrated the entire situation. The contradictions in her story would be obvious to any competent investigator. The evening news trucks arrived within 2 hours, their satellite antennas rising like metallic flowers in the gathering darkness. Judge Blackwood's arrest was already the lead story on local stations, with reporters describing the unprecedented situation of a sitting judge being taken into custody for public intoxication at his own anniversary party. Emma retreated into the house, but I could see her through the windows, pacing frantically while talking on her phone. She was probably calling lawyers, trying to find someone who could minimize the damage to Judge Blackwood's career and their reputation. But the viral videos of his arrest were already spreading beyond local news outlets, picked up by legal blogs, and social media accounts that specialized in judicial misconduct. My cousin Rebecca approached me as I prepared to leave the gathering chaos. "Jessica, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." I nodded, prepared for whatever question she had. "Have you really been having the mental health problems that Emma's been describing to the family? The depression, the anger issues, the concerning behaviors she's been worried about?" The question confirmed what I'd suspected about Emma's campaign of character assassination. She hadn't just been spreading lies to our immediate family. She'd been systematically poisoning my relationships with extended family members and family friends. "No," I said simply. "I've never discussed any of those issues with Emma because I don't have those issues. I've never been on psychiatric medication, never been in therapy for PTSD, never exhibited any of the behaviors she's described." Rebecca's expression shifted as she processed this information. "But she's been so worried about you for months. She joined online support groups for military families, researched treatment facilities, even asked me to help stage an intervention." "What kind of intervention?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "She wanted the family to confront you about your refusal to get help, to present you with ultimatums about treatment or medication compliance. She said you were in denial about how serious your problems had become." The scope of Emma's manipulation was even broader than I'd realized. She'd been recruiting family members to participate in her fictional narrative, building a network of people who would support her claims about my mental instability when the time came for legal action. "Rebecca, I need you to think carefully about your interactions with Emma regarding my supposed mental health. Did she ever show you any actual evidence of concerning behavior, or did she just tell you stories about things that had happened?" Rebecca paused, clearly reviewing months of conversations in her mind. She never showed me anything concrete. No texts or voicemails that seemed concerning, no photos or videos of erratic behavior. Just stories about things you'd supposedly said or done. And did any of those stories match the Jessica you've known for the past 30 years? No, Rebecca admitted slowly. They didn't. But Emma was so convincing, so worried and detailed in her descriptions. I thought maybe military service had changed you in ways I couldn't see. I pulled out my phone and showed Rebecca some of the evidence I'd collected, including screenshots of Emma's message threads describing my fictional mental breakdown. Rebecca's face went pale as she read Emma's elaborate fabrications about my supposed psychiatric symptoms and dangerous behaviors. "She's been lying," Rebecca whispered. "About everything, for months." "Yes," I confirmed. "And tonight she tried to drug me to create evidence that would support those lies. Judge Blackwood was planning to have me forcibly committed based on Emma's fabricated concerns about my mental health." The criminal conspiracy was becoming clear to Rebecca, and I could see her struggling to reconcile the Emma she'd trusted with the Emma who'd been orchestrating my destruction for months. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to tell the truth," I replied. "All of it. The lies Emma's been spreading, the evidence I've collected about Judge Blackwood's corruption, and what really happened here tonight." Rebecca nodded, slowly. "I'll testify too, if needed, about the messages Emma sent me, about the intervention she wanted to stage, about how none of it matched the person you actually are. Emma's carefully constructed house of lies was collapsing, and she no longer had the power to control the narrative or silence the people who could expose her deception." The phone calls began at 6 in the morning, less than 12 hours after Judge Blackwood's arrest had made the local evening news. I was already awake, having spent most of the night reviewing my documentation and preparing for my statement to Detective Morrison, when my parents' number appeared on my phone screen. "Jessica, thank God you answered," my mother's voice was, strained with panic. "We just saw the news about Richard. Emma called us crying, saying there was some kind of misunderstanding at the party. She said you were involved somehow, but she wasn't making much sense." I could hear my father in the background, his voice raised as he spoke to someone else, probably Emma on another phone. The family crisis management system was already in full swing, with everyone scrambling to understand what had happened and how to minimize the damage to their reputations. "Mom, there wasn't a misunderstanding," I said carefully. "Emma put something in a drink that was intended for me, and Judge Blackwood ended up consuming it instead. He was arrested because he appeared to be under the influence of an unknown substance." The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief and dawning horror. My mother had always preferred Emma's version of events over mine, always found ways to excuse Emma's behavior while holding me to impossible standards. But even she couldn't ignore the implications of what I was telling her. "That's impossible," she finally said. "Emma would never do something like that. She's been worried sick about you for months, trying to get you help. There has to be another explanation." The predictable response confirmed that Emma had been preparing our parents for this moment, priming them to reject any accusations against her while reinforcing their belief in my supposed mental instability. But the evidence was too overwhelming for even my parents to dismiss completely. "Mom, Emma has been lying to you about my mental health for years. I've never had the problems she's described, never needed the intervention she's suggested, never exhibited the behaviors she's reported. She's been building a false case against me to justify having me forcibly committed." My father took the phone, his voice tight with anger. "Jessica, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this has gone too far. Your sister has been nothing but concerned about your welfare, and now you're trying to destroy her marriage over some imagined slight." The casual dismissal of my accusations as an imagined slight revealed how deeply Emma's narrative had penetrated their understanding of our relationship. In their minds, I was the problem child who caused drama and conflict, while Emma was the responsible daughter who tried to maintain family harmony. "Dad, I have documentation of everything," I said firmly. "Emails, recordings, financial records. Emma and Judge Blackwood have been planning this for months. They were going to have Me arrested last night, then committed to a psychiatric facility based on lies Emma has been telling about my mental state. That's enough, my father snapped. I don't want to hear any more of this paranoid nonsense. You need to get help, Jessica. Real help, not whatever you think you're accomplishing with these wild accusations. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone and marveling at Emma's complete capture of our parents' perception of reality. Even with their son-in-law in police custody and evidence mounting against their golden daughter, they were still more willing to believe that I was having a psychotic episode than that Emma had been lying to them for years. The second call came from Emma herself, her voice hoarse from crying but still carrying the manipulative undertones I'd learned to recognize over the years. "Jessica, please," she began without preamble. "I know you're angry with me, but you have to understand that everything I've done has been out of love and concern for you. I was trying to help you get the treatment you need." "By drugging me and having me arrested?" I asked. "By lying to the family about my mental health for months? By conspiring with your husband to have me forcibly committed based on fabricated evidence?" "I never meant for Richard to get hurt," Emma said, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine remorse. "I just wanted you to get help before you hurt yourself or someone else. The things you've been saying, the way you've been acting, I was scared for you." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired the skill involved. Emma was simultaneously admitting to drugging my drink while positioning it as a compassionate intervention, acknowledging her conspiracy while framing it as concern for my welfare. "Emma, I've been recording our conversations for months," I said quietly. "I have documentation of your lies, evidence of Judge Blackwood's corruption, proof of your plan to destroy my life. The police have blood test results showing what you put in that drink. This isn't about my mental health anymore. It's about your criminal behavior." The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Emma spoke again, her voice now cold and calculating. "If you think you can destroy my life and walk away clean, you're mistaken. I know things about you too, Jessica. Things from your military service that the family doesn't know about. Things that could ruin your reputation just as thoroughly as you're trying to ruin mine." The threat was hollow, and we both knew it. Emma had never shown any interest in my military service beyond using it as ammunition for her mental health narrative. She had no idea what I'd actually done overseas, no access to classified information or embarrassing incidents that could be used against me. "Go ahead," I replied calmly. "Share whatever you think you know. I'm sure it will be just as fictional as everything else you've been telling people about me." My phone buzzed with another incoming call, this one from an unknown number with a local area code. I ended the call with Emma and answered the new one. "Miss Martinez, this is attorney Sarah Chen from the State Bar Association's Judicial Conduct Board. We've received some concerning information about Judge Blackwood's arrest last night, and we understand you may have relevant testimony about his conduct. Would you be available to meet with our investigators this afternoon?" The official wheels were already turning. Judge Blackwood's arrest had triggered automatic reviews by multiple oversight bodies, and Emma's involvement was expanding the scope of the investigation beyond simple public intoxication. The conspiracy I'd uncovered was about to be examined by professionals with the authority to impose real consequences. "Yes, I'll be available," I confirmed. "I have extensive documentation that I believe will be relevant to your investigation." After ending the call, I sat in my small apartment and realized that the point of no return had been crossed. There was no walking back from this confrontation, no possibility of returning to the dysfunctional family dynamic that had defined my life for so many years. Emma's attempt to destroy me had instead exposed the corruption and manipulation that had been hiding beneath the surface of our seemingly respectable family. The attempted reconciliation phase was beginning, just as I'd predicted. Emma, my parents, and probably other family members would soon be reaching out with offers to work things out and put this behind us. They would want to return to the status quo without addressing the fundamental issues that had created this crisis. but I was no longer the accommodating daughter who absorbed abuse to maintain family peace. I was no longer willing to accept gaslighting and manipulation as the price of belonging to a family that had never truly accepted me. The quiet one had finally found her voice, and she was going to use it to tell the truth about what had been happening in the shadows of their perfect suburban lives. The transformation began in Detective Morrison's interview room at 9 o'clock the next morning. I sat across from him with 3 manila folders containing years of documentation, feeling calmer than I had in months. This wasn't the scared veteran they'd been planning to arrest. This was someone who had prepared for war and was ready to fight it on legal battlegrounds. Morrison spread the photographs of the emails across the metal table, his expression growing more serious with each image. The correspondence between Judge Blackwood and Dr. Wynn laid out their conspiracy in clinical detail, complete with financial arrangements and previous victims. When he reached the recording transcripts, Morrison looked up at me with something approaching awe. "Miss Martinez, this is extensive federal corruption documentation. You realize what you've uncovered here goes far beyond last night's incident." "Yes, sir. Judge Blackwood and my sister have been systematically destroying people who posed threats to their interests. I was just their latest target." I handed him the flash drive containing the audio files. "Everything is time-stamped and verified. I followed military intelligence protocols for evidence collection." Morrison plugged in the drive and listened to 30 seconds of Judge Blackwood's voice discussing permanent psychiatric commitment. His jaw tightened as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "We're going to need FBI involvement for this. The corruption charges alone will require federal prosecution." By noon, I was sitting in a conference room with FBI Special Agent Patricia Wells and Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez. They'd reviewed my evidence package and were asking detailed questions about the timeline of Emma's character assassination campaign. "The systematic nature of this conspiracy is remarkable," Agent Wells noted, reviewing Emma's fabricated medical history she'd constructed for me. "Your sister spent 2 years building a fictional case for your mental incompetence, involving multiple family members and community leaders in the deception." "It was more than deception," I corrected. "It was preparation for my permanent disappearance. Once I was committed, they could control my finances, my medical care, my contact with the outside world. I would have effectively ceased to exist as a free person." Attorney Rodriguez was particularly interested in the financial aspects. Judge Blackwood was essentially selling judicial decisions and using his position to eliminate personal threats. "The corruption charges will be extensive, but the conspiracy to commit false imprisonment could result in decades of federal prison time." The investigation expanded rapidly throughout the week. FBI agents searched Judge Blackwood's chambers and home office, discovering additional evidence of bribery, case-fixing, and abuse of judicial authority. Dr. Wynn's practice was raided, revealing files on dozens of questionable psychiatric commitments that had benefited Judge Blackwood's associates. Emma's house became a crime scene as agents collected evidence of her systematic campaign against me. They found printed emails, research on psychiatric medications, and handwritten notes planning my arrest and commitment. The documentation revealed a level of premeditation that elevated the charges from simple assault to conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and false imprisonment. The local media coverage was relentless. Judge Blackwood's arrest had been shocking enough, but the emerging details of the corruption conspiracy dominated news cycles for weeks. Emma found herself at the center of a federal investigation, her picture appearing on television screens alongside graphics describing criminal charges and potential prison sentences. My parents made one final attempt at family reconciliation, arriving at my apartment unannounced with tears and confused demands for explanation. My mother clutched a tissue box while my father paced my small living room, struggling to reconcile their golden daughter with the criminal charges being filed against her. "This has to be some kind of misunderstanding," my mother insisted. "Emma loves you. She's always been concerned about your welfare. There has to be another explanation for all this. I showed them Emma's message threads discussing my fabricated mental illness, the emails planning my psychiatric commitment, and the financial records documenting bribes to Dr. Wynne. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and completely devastating to their understanding of their family dynamics. She was going to have me permanently committed to a psychiatric facility based on lies, I explained calmly. I would have spent the rest of my life in institutional custody, forgotten, and silenced, while she told everyone how sad she was about my tragic mental breakdown. My father's anger finally found its target. How could you have let this go so far without telling us what was happening? We could have stopped this before it reached criminal charges. The accusation was typical of our family's dysfunction. Somehow, my failure to report my own victimization was more serious than Emma's years of systematic abuse. I realized in that moment that they would never truly understand what had happened, never acknowledge their role in enabling Emma's behavior, never apologize for believing her lies over my reality. I did try to tell you, I replied quietly. Every time Emma made false claims about my behavior, every time she invented stories about my mental health, every time she positioned herself as my concerned caretaker while undermining my credibility, you chose to believe her version of events. The conversation ended with my parents leaving in confused anger, unable to process that their family narrative had been built on systematic deception and manipulation. They wanted to return to the comfortable fiction that Emma was the good daughter and I was the problematic one, but the criminal evidence made that impossible. 2 weeks after the anniversary party, I received an offer that changed everything. The Veteran Services organization I'd been volunteering with offered me a position as their regional coordinator, managing programs for female veterans transitioning to civilian life. The salary was modest but sufficient, and more importantly, the work connected directly to my own experiences of struggle and resilience. My new apartment was in a different part of the county, far from Emma's neighborhood and the scenes of our family drama. I furnished it with items I chose for myself, colors and textures that brought me comfort rather than matching someone else's aesthetic preferences. For the first time in years, I was building a life that reflected my own values and priorities. The community design program I'd been developing expanded rapidly as word spread about my work with underrepresented young women. We received grant funding, corporate sponsorships, and volunteer support from other veterans who understood the importance of mentorship and skill development. The program became a model that other organizations wanted to replicate. Judge Blackwood was disbarred while awaiting trial on federal corruption charges. Dr. Wynne lost her medical license and faced criminal charges for her role in fraudulent psychiatric commitments. Emma was released on bail but faced serious federal charges that could result in substantial prison time. The family WhatsApp group that had excluded me for months was now silent. There were no more cheerful updates about Emma's perfect life, no more photos of anniversary celebrations or milestone achievements. The golden daughter had become the family scandal, while the supposedly damaged veteran had emerged as the survivor and truth-teller. I didn't celebrate their downfall because I understood that justice and revenge were different things. Justice meant that their victims would be protected from future harm, that the corrupt system they'd built would be dismantled, that the truth would replace the lies they'd been spreading for years. My transformation wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about finally becoming who I'd always been underneath the family dynamics that had tried to diminish and silence me. 6 months after the anniversary party that changed everything, I stood before a congressional subcommittee on Veterans Affairs, my prepared testimony crisp in my hands, and my voice steady despite the national television cameras. The hearing was focused on protecting veterans from family exploitation and legal abuse, using my case as the primary example of how vulnerable veterans could be systematically targeted by those closest to them. Honorable members of the committee, I began, what happened to me was not an isolated incident of family dysfunction. It was a calculated conspiracy that exploited common misconceptions about veteran mental health to justify the elimination of an inconvenient family member. The story of Emma and Judge Blackwood's conspiracy had become a catalyst for legislative reform. My testimony led to the introduction of the Veterans Protection from Family Exploitation Act, which required additional oversight for psychiatric commitments of veterans and created penalties for filing false reports about veteran mental health status. Emma's sentencing hearing had taken place the previous month. She received 4 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit false imprisonment, filing false police reports, and wire fraud related to her systematic character assassination campaign. Judge Blackwood received 12 years for judicial corruption, bribery, and conspiracy charges. Dr. Wynn lost her medical license permanently and received 6 years for her role in fraudulent psychiatric commitments. The courtroom had been packed, with other victims who'd emerged during the investigation, business rivals who'd been committed after threatening to expose Judge Blackwood's financial irregularities, family members who'd been institutionalized when they became inconvenient, former court employees who'd been silenced through forced psychiatric evaluation after witnessing corruption. During her sentencing statement, Emma had finally shown genuine remorse, but it was focused on the consequences to herself rather than the harm she'd caused others. She spoke about losing her house, her reputation, her place in the community. She mentioned her fear of prison and her hope for eventual forgiveness from the family. She never directly apologized to me. My parents attended the sentencing, but sat on Emma's side of the courtroom, still struggling to fully accept their golden daughter's transformation into a convicted felon. They'd written character reference letters for Emma's sentencing, describing her as a loving sister who'd made serious mistakes while trying to help her troubled veteran sibling. The letters revealed that they still didn't understand what had actually happened. Even with overwhelming evidence of Emma's deliberate cruelty and systematic deception, they preferred to believe that her actions had been misguided attempts at intervention rather than calculated destruction. The cognitive dissonance was too painful for them to resolve. I hadn't spoken to my parents since Emma's conviction. They'd made it clear that they viewed my cooperation with federal prosecutors as a betrayal of family loyalty, regardless of the criminal nature of Emma's actions. They wanted me to minimize my testimony, accept a plea deal that would reduce Emma's sentence, and participate in family therapy to heal the divisions that my accusations had created. But I'd learned that healing couldn't happen without acknowledgement of the harm that had been caused. Family loyalty couldn't supersede justice, and forgiveness couldn't be demanded without genuine accountability. The quiet daughter who'd once absorbed abuse to maintain family peace had been replaced by someone who understood that real peace required real truth. The veteran community had embraced my story as an example of resilience and strategic thinking under extreme pressure. I'd been invited to speak at military transition programs, warning veterans about the vulnerability that came with family dependency and teaching them to recognize signs of exploitation and manipulation. My work with the Regional Veteran Services organization had expanded into a national consulting role, helping other programs develop resources for veterans facing family conflicts and legal abuse. The Community Design Program had received federal funding and was being replicated in 6 other states, providing career development and mentorship for young women from military families. The financial settlement from Judge Blackwood's seized assets provided enough money to buy a small house in a neighborhood where nobody knew about my family's scandal. The house came with a garden where I planted vegetables and flowers, creating something beautiful from soil that had been neglected for years. Emma's children, my niece and nephew, had been placed with their paternal grandparents during their parents' legal proceedings. I'd sent cards on their birthdays and holidays, maintaining connection without forcing contact they might not want. They were innocent victims of their parents' crimes, struggling to understand why their previously perfect family had imploded so dramatically. The ripple effects of exposing Judge Blackwood's corruption extended far beyond our family situation. The FBI investigation had revealed a network of judicial misconduct involving 3 other judges and dozens of questionable psychiatric commitments. Several victims who'd been wrongfully institutionalized were released and compensated for their imprisonment. Dr. Wynn's fraudulent practice had been completely dismantled, with independent medical reviews determining that approximately 60% of her commitment recommendations had been based on insufficient or fabricated evidence. The state legislature passed new regulations requiring second opinions for all involuntary psychiatric holds and creating oversight boards with veteran representation. The media attention had been intense, but ultimately positive. My story became a case study in how systematic documentation and strategic thinking could overcome institutional bias and family manipulation. Law schools use the case to teach students about evidence collection and witness preparation in corruption cases. I'd been contacted by other veterans facing similar family exploitation, people whose relatives were attempting to control their disability benefits, steal their property, or have them committed to gain access to their assets. The pattern was more common than anyone had realized, hidden by shame and the assumption that family members always acted in veterans' best interests. My testimony before Congress concluded with specific recommendations for protecting vulnerable veterans from family exploitation, mandatory waiting periods for psychiatric commitments of veterans unless they posed immediate danger to themselves or others, required legal representation for veterans facing involuntary commitment proceedings, financial oversight for veterans, benefits when family members served as representative payees. The legislation passed unanimously, signed into law by a president who'd made veteran protection a priority of his administration. The bill was informally known as Jessica's Law, though I'd requested that it be named for all veterans who'd faced similar abuse rather than being associated with my specific case. Standing in my garden that evening after returning from Washington, I thought about the woman who'd walked into that anniversary party 6 months earlier. She'd been isolated, financially struggling, and completely unaware of the conspiracy that had been developing around her for years. She'd believed that family loyalty required accepting abuse and that speaking truth would destroy relationships that weren't worth preserving. The woman who'd emerged from that experience understood that real strength came from refusing to be diminished by other people's limitations. That justice sometimes required destroying the comfortable lies that enabled systematic harm, that the quiet ones often had the most powerful voices once they decided to use them. Emma would serve her sentence and eventually be released to rebuild whatever life she could construct from the ruins of her previous existence. Judge Blackwood would likely die in federal prison, his corruption having destroyed not just his own career, but the lives of dozens of people he'd sworn to serve. But I was still here, still building, still creating something meaningful from the ashes of what had tried to consume me. The glass switch at that anniversary party hadn't just saved my freedom. It had revealed the truth that set multiple victims free and created protections for countless others who might have faced similar destruction. 2 years later, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. A young woman in army fatigues stood nervously in my doorway, her hands shaking as she held a folder of documents. "Ma'am, I heard about your case," she said quietly. "My family is trying to have me committed. They say I'm unstable, that my combat deployment broke me. But I know what I saw in my stepfather's business records. He's been stealing veteran benefits. And when I tried to report it, they started the mental health accusations." I invited her to sit, recognizing the fear and determination in her eyes that I'd once seen in my own mirror. Her story was different, in details but identical in pattern. Family exploitation disguised as concern, systematic character assassination, preparation for forced institutionalization to silence an inconvenient truth-teller. "What's your name?" I asked. "Specialist Sarah Chen, ma'am. And I've been documenting everything, just like you did." Over the next 3 hours, I helped Sarah organize her evidence, connected her with the FBI agents who'd handled my case, and assured her that she wasn't alone in this fight. Her stepfather's veteran benefit fraud would be exposed, her family's manipulation would be documented, and her freedom would be protected. As she left my office with a plan of action and a network of support, I realized that Emma's attempt to Destroy Me had actually created something she never intended. A system that protected other veterans from the same fate she'd planned for me. The quiet ones don't stay quiet forever. We document, we strategize, and when the moment is right, we strike with precision that our enemies never see coming. Sometimes the best revenge is simply surviving long enough to build something better from the wreckage they tried to create. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We share real stories of courage, justice, and triumph every week. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful testimonies to light.